Are we recording?
Yep, you're all set.
Oh, good. Hopefully you'll delete all that beginning stuff that we were talking about. So we're talking about the AmeriCorps budget today as part of the RFP process with ServeRI. And of course, like all things AmeriCorps, budgets, AmeriCorps budgets are different than other budgets, right? This webinar is being recorded, and we're hoping that folks are listening through the YouTube now. But we're going to do some back and forth. So remember, you can use Alt-A to unmute yourself quickly or click the unmute on your screen. I always like to introduce myself, even though you already know that my name is Adam Donaldson, and I'm your National Community Service Program Specialist at the Rhode Island Department of Education. And along with Amanda Forget, we have the responsibility of the AmeriCorps grant process. So always 3 presentation results in my mind. Today, I want to make sure that you know how to calculate grant award amount, how much money can you receive through the AmeriCorps RFP, and understand the minimum match or cost share that you're going to be required to provide. I want to increase your awareness of typical AmeriCorps program expenditures, what actually goes into the budget. And hopefully I want you to feel confident understanding some of the AmeriCorps specific requirements like the match, living allowance, and indirect costs. So we'll see if we can do that starting now. First, sort of a sidebar note, your proposal will be to operate a 1-year project period and a 1-year budget, even though AmeriCorps grants are typically awarded for 3 years. So you're really describing 1 year of activity. If you receive an AmeriCorps award, there will be a process annually called the continuation application, where you will have the opportunity to submit a new budget and make any changes to your program or to suggest and request permission to change aspects of your program through the continuation application. So just to know, we're talking about 1 year of expenditures, even though the grant itself will go for 3 years. You know, when you get a typical grant announcement from a funder or a corporation, they'll let you know that you can receive $25,000 or whatever it is. But AmeriCorps grants don't award that kind of predetermined total amount. Instead, our grants provide funding based on a calculation of member service years. One AmeriCorps member serving for 1,700 hours in 1 year is equal to 1 member service year. So if your program design has more than 1 member, which it will, or if the program design includes members committed to other terms of service or slot types that are not 1,700 hours, then you're going to need to calculate from the beginning your program's total MSYs. If you apply for an education award only program, you're going to receive $800 times that number of MSYs. If you apply for a traditional cost reimbursement grant, you'll submit a budget to request up to $16,300 times the number of MSYs. You may hear me talk about the average cost per MSY, which in order to be compliant has to be that $16,300 or less. So let's just take a look at this. The RFP describes the MSY calculation method. In this table, we have the different types of AmeriCorps member positions or slot types that AmeriCorps has predetermined through these categories of hours: 1,700 hours, 900 hours, 300 hours, etc. And AmeriCorps uses a 7-digit decimal to describe the proportion of time relative to that 1,700-hour full-time position for the other service terms. My advice, don't try and understand that. Don't understand, don't try and understand these decimals or the hours or anything like that. But understand that you need to use this table to calculate your MSYs, and you need to use these 7-digit decimals. We're going to simply multiply across the table the number of members times that MSY calculation decimal to get a total of MSYs. So for example, you imagine a program designed with 10 AmeriCorps members who are serving in the 1,200-hour time slot. Maybe they're serving from September to June in a school-based setting, and they're going to complete 1,200 hours. It's a straight multiplication of 10 members times the MSY ratio of 0.7, and the result of that is 7 MSYs. Now, in the traditional model, you multiply that by 16,300. And if you got out your calculator, you would arrive at $114,100. And that's the amount of money that you can request from Server I, from AmeriCorps, to operate your proposed program. Now, if you want to consider a different example that's a little bit more complicated, imagine a program that's designed with part-time AmeriCorps members, and there are 8 members affiliated with an opioid prevention program that do education events and peer mentoring, and they serve 450 hours over a period of 12 months. But in addition, this same health-based program has a high school education component that does school visits and role-playing workshops, and they have a design that has 3 teams of 5 AmeriCorps members or 15 members, each serving 300 hours over the course of the school year, September to May. So when you do that math and you use the table, you're going to plug in your 8 AmeriCorps members at the 450 mark, the 15 at the 300-hour mark, and you're going to not ask why, but use your MSY 7-digit decimals, multiply across the row, and then add up, right, both lines and arrive at 5.29. At some point, right, it makes sense to round, and 2 decimals is usually acceptable. But if you wanted to leave it all out, you can. For the purposes of this example, I took the $16,300 and multiplied it by 5.29. And that calculator tells me $86,227. Now, I think it's kind of interesting to note that in this example too, you've got 23 AmeriCorps members, which is more than twice of the other example, but you're actually receiving less funding from the AmeriCorps program because it's the design, right, was for fewer hours. These members are in part-time commitments. So you need to think about this when you're sort of calculating out whether or not the program you imagine is going to be financially feasible for you. And it might take some different testing and imagining and scenarios until you arrive at what's going to work. Just as a final example, if we kept the same program design with the 8 AmeriCorps members and the 15 AmeriCorps members, but we decided to operate this as an education-only award program, in that case, we're only providing an upfront fixed amount of $800 times the 5.29 MSYs, which is only going to be $4,232 to support the administration and administration of the program, operational costs. You, in this education award only program, don't submit a detailed budget or need to document how you're contributing cost share or matching funds to the overall program. It's a more streamlined grant, and in almost all cases, you wouldn't be providing a living allowance to these AmeriCorps members, but all the program costs would be your responsibility to run this type of program. I'm going to pause for questions before we talk about calculating your match responsibility.
I think I'm good with that part. It makes sense to me.
Thanks. And I was just checking the chat, so I see that. Great. Then calculating the minimum match. AmeriCorps application budgets require that you show expenditures from your own resources of cash or in kind, and this is called cost sharing, or more frequently in our AmeriCorps lingo, match. So for new grantees, the required match rate is 24% for the first 3 years. And I'll note you can always exceed the 24%. And oftentimes when folks put together budgets, we do see that they exceed 24%, which is fine. We recommend trying to submit a budget with as low a match as possible, just in order to prevent any future problems when a source of funding doesn't come through, or in terms of having to document donations. It just creates, it could, if the match is not necessary to operating the program, you get no points or high fives for showing that 80% of the program is on your side of the ledger and that you're contributing to versus AmeriCorps. Before you build a budget, I really think it's important to understand the match requirements. It's not that your match requirement is not 24% of the grant award, but it's 24% of your total budget. So there's a mathematical trick that will help you kind of determine how much match funding you're going to need. And there's an example on the screen. That formula is to take the total funding request. We had an example earlier that I was just going to use here of $114,100. Say that was the total funding request. And you divide that by 1 minus the 24% match rate requirement. And that shows you what the total project budget would need to be at a minimum in order to have built in your 24% match. So then to find out the exact dollar amount, you can take the total project budget, subtract the funding request that you're making to AmeriCorps of the $114,100. And when you do that math, you see that your match is going to need to be $36,032. That seems hard to explain orally. And so, I rely, like a math teacher, go back to the formula, substitute the words for the numbers, and you'll be able to do it. Just takes a little bit of step-by-step patience. So again, when you're building the budget, in this example, in order for it to pass muster, it would have to say that the local contribution is $36,000, or it could say 40,000, 50,000, etc. But the 36032 would become a minimum requirement. We're actually going to jump now to a budget worksheet rather than slide presentation mode, and kind of try and build out a budget together, going through each category. There are instructions in the RFP, and I'm really just highlighting all of the information that's there. Again, at serverrhode-island.com/grants. But when we're thinking about building out our budget and thinking about what are we going to need to spend money on, if you get stuck, just a reminder that we did spend all this time creating a great logic model. And that logic model includes resources, the inputs and activities that you're going to need to do for the program. And that might trigger some thoughts about things that you're going to need to include in your budget. All right. We're going to, I promised we were going to do this. So at serverrhode-island.com/grants, there is included, besides the RFP, a budget template or worksheet in an Excel format. And that's what I've opened now. Amanda, can you see that?
Yes.
Amazing. I'm getting so much better at this. And it follows the information that you need to enter into eGrants, the online grant management system. And it starts with personnel. So the basic way that we're going to do personnel is we're going to figure out who are we going to need to operate this program, and we're going to list each position on a separate line. We're going to identify their annual salary and multiply that by the percentage of effort they're giving to the AmeriCorps program, or FTE. So just as an example, let's imagine here that we're doing a 10 person, 10 AmeriCorps members. We're going to use that 1,200 hour AmeriCorps member slot type. We'll stick with that for now. And to manage this program, we've decided that we're going to dedicate an existing staff member's time to shift really to managing this program. And we're just starting, and we've decided, well, I think we're going to have one of these individuals who has an annual salary of $42,000 operate at half of her or his time, right? And we're going to enter that in the worksheet. And when we go to eGrants, there'll be a place to explain that same calculation. So now here comes the part where you kind of decide what you want to do in terms of, is that money being charged to the AmeriCorps award, the CNCS Corp share, which stands for Corporation for National and Community Service, the federal agency, or the grantee share? When I first build a budget, I would recommend just starting by putting money in both categories. unless you have a firm idea of what you need to do. And then, this is something that you're going to go back and forth with. You're going to engage your executive director, and if you have finance staff and you are not they, you're going to talk with them about what things actually cost, right? This is going to take some time to develop. So, but in our example, I'm all about using formulas. So I'm going to type in, first of all, that we're doing the 42,000, right? And we're doing it at half. But I'm going to put 75% of that. Oh, doesn't like my formula. Into the CNCS share. And I'm going to put the other 25% because I know I'm kind of trying to get to 24% overall. And that's not going to be exactly right, but it's going to be the place that I start. And this worksheet will help you with that, right? It's automatically added the CNCS share and the grantee share together and gotten to 21,000. So just to emphasize, you're going to list each staff person and you're going to calculate their annual salary times their percent of effort. And then you're going to determine whether or not to charge that to AmeriCorps, the CNCS share, or whether you're contributing that. One of the common ways that we see AmeriCorps programs collaborate and demonstrate cost sharing is they might have placed their AmeriCorps member at another location where a partner is doing the supervision. And they might have a position of AmeriCorps supervisor, and they might have a similar calculation, and they might note that it's in kind, and it might all be in grantee share. There could be, some number of grantee share here. It's a common way that AmeriCorps budgets get developed. So they're not personnel that are actually part of your organization, but they're at a partner organization. And in that case, they might be an important part of the program, but they're also financially, through their service, contributing to the program. If you use that model, though, those individuals are going to have to go through the AmeriCorps National Community Service criminal history check, and they're going to have to be able to provide you with timesheets or other information to verify the time that they spent on the AmeriCorps program for your records. All right. The next category is fringe. This is the benefits that we all want and love from our employers, healthcare, and retirement, and includes always this FICA. So that's always included, 7.65%. The way that you do fringe benefits is your organization may have a rate that it always applies to these types of grant applications and for budgeting purposes. And you're allowed to use that rate if it follows a policy established at your organization if that rate is 30% or lower. If it exceeds 30%, then your budget has to actually itemize the different categories of benefits that you offer to your employees. But for our purposes, let's imagine that we are keeping things, we have a nice organization that keeps things simple, and we have a, what number do we like? 27%. We have a fringe rate of 27%, right? What am I using? Times salary. You need to provide the basis of the calculation in a way that the reviewer can understand it. So again, if you like to use Excel, it looks like the template already had 22% in there. You might decide to do that, on paper outside of the worksheet, or if you're even better at Excel than I am, you'll be typing in fancy formulas to arrive at what 27% of. And notice that although in this example, we've done 27% of the same amount that's in the column, because it just psychologically makes sense to do that. There's no specific requirement. You could put all of this charged to the grant or put it in grantee share. So you're gonna always have some fringe costs, I would assume. And at a minimum, you'll have FICA in your budget of 7.65%. That's just a requirement. We're gonna move on to travel, but I'm gonna see if there are any questions. There's nothing in the chat. So travel. Travel is divided up into separately staff and member travel. Travel can be used to go from the office to service locations. It can be used to attend ServerI events. Could be used to go to relevant training. And very frequently we see mileage reimbursement. Mileage reimbursement should be calculated based on the current federal guidelines, which right now is 57.5 cents. You can also travel out of state if it's relevant, especially to like training conferences for your service area, etc. And we would expect to see airfare, the cost of lodging, perhaps the taxi or the per diem, all explained in the calculation. So with travel, you're going to first explain the purpose of the travel in some, travel to serve RI events, because we want you to attend all our events, and you're going to do some planning and figure out that over the course of the year, it's Rhode Island, we don't go so far. It's only going to need 100 miles, something like that. And you're going to show that calculation. And maybe you've decided in this case, I'm going to charge it all to the AmeriCorps grant. So you can do that math. And if I didn't mention this earlier, we only use rounded numbers, so the pennies always disappear in our budgets. we follow basic rounding rules of 0.5 and above is 1. Member travel is often something we see here in the worksheet example itself that's on our website, it shows giving bus passes to the AmeriCorps members for use to ride the buses. And if those were $70 a month and you had 10 AmeriCorps members in service for 10 months, that would add up to $7,000. And maybe you've arranged to receive that in some way, or maybe you're paying for that for cash. That is an allowable expense. Member travel has to be not for, typical commuting from their home to service, though. It's not just a perk or a benefit. But if you need to frequently have them travel for their service activity or to get to their service site or to get to, again, server eye events, you're certainly encouraged to not have them pay for that from their living allowance, but to provide that through another way. So we're humming right along. Equipment. Equipment's kind of a funny one, in that the only thing that you're going to place into equipment are single items that cost more than $5,000 and are used for more than a year. So equipment is like, I think the classic example is a copy machine that's super important and dedicated to the AmeriCorps program. A 15-passenger van that will only be used in your AmeriCorps program. Potentially could be in equipment, but it is very rare in the AmeriCorps budgets that we see an expense that should be in the equipment category. In contrast, we do see a lot of items in supplies. So supplies are items that do not normally get used for more than a year, but they're consumable. And you're going to state the purpose of the supply and provide, an estimate for how much each item costs and how many items that you need in describing, how you arrived at the amount of funding. If an item, however, costs more than $1,000, maybe it's a software program or something like that, and it costs more than $1,000 to purchase. That needs to be its own line item. Otherwise, typically the line items here might be office supplies, training supplies. We always want to see some explanation of AmeriCorps identity here in supplies. We at Server Eye love to see that AmeriCorps members are going to have a t-shirt or other uniform part that we call gear in order to be visibly identified in the community while they're serving. It is permissible to choose less expensive options for ways to do that, or rather than having something in the budget, have an explanation of why you're not charging for meeting that requirement, that you have some other way of going about it. That's acceptable as well, but we look for AmeriCorps gear in the supply category. And so we'll accept basic mathematical formulas like $60, and we have 10 members, so it's going to be $600, or more specific things like the lanyard is $3 and the t-shirt is $12 and we're going to spend $15 times each member and putting that into the budget. Are there any other ideas or examples for what might constitute a supply item that would be relevant to an AmeriCorps program that I haven't thought of yet? Because I've been rambling here. Amanda or Tori, anything that you think we should add in?
Looks good so far. And Tori says she can't think of anything off the top of her head right now.
All right. Then let's keep a moving. The next category is the most fun. And why I say that is we often see a lot of activity in the area of contracts and consultant services. The first thing to know is that the AmeriCorps budget has separate budget categories for training and for evaluation that we're about to get to. So if you have a contract or consultant related to training or evaluation, you're going to place them in that budget category, not here for general services. When you have a consultant that is supporting the operations of your program, you're going to list the purpose and you're going to provide a daily rate. So maybe in addition to the AmeriCorps program director, you actually, instead of a staff position, you have a financial consultant who really helps with the AmeriCorps project. And you are going to include them in your budget as part of the project. So you're going to let us know that they're paid a daily rate, and then over the course of the year, how many days in terms, assuming an 8-hour day, how many hours of their time are you going to be using specifically for the AmeriCorps project? And, you know, for purposes of just here, I'm just going to say 20 days. But now I'm going to remember my cute style of saying 800 times 20 to remind myself. And I'm going to do my split of 75%. And here 25%, because that's just how I like to start my budget. And that's all you need to provide there. Training is also an area where we see a lot of activity in AmeriCorps budgets because the staff need to be trained in the service model, the supervisors maybe need training in AmeriCorps, and of course the members who are separated out in terms of training costs have to be go through pre-service orientation or ongoing training. The costs that you might see elsewhere in supplies or consultants or other categories can instead be here when their purpose is training, and same with evaluation. If you're using a consultant to deliver the training, or in the calculation, we would expect again to see the daily rate times the number of days, even if it's just a few hours, right, expressed as a part of a day, in order to show why you need that particular amount of money. You might also, in say staff training, think about registration fees to attend local workshops or events that provide them with information that's relevant to the project. Or, you know, it's really different now in terms of coronavirus affecting conferences and that sort of thing. But there is an annual regionalized national service conference for AmeriCorps programs that was scheduled to be in Vermont this year, and that has a $350 registration fee. It's a multiple day conference. So sometimes we'll see those types of costs here. It's really about staff training that's for effective project implementation, financial management, or perhaps team building. And the same in member training, training for service activities. Sometimes there's a curriculum workbook that needs to be purchased, or consultant. You might be training them in life after AmeriCorps type activities, their career development. It's also an area where AmeriCorps programs often show demonstrations of community support and add in-kind funds to their budget. So if you imagine a partner organization is going to train the AmeriCorps members in an evidence-based service program, and they are consultants who provide this service to you for free because they're so proud and mission driven in the work that you're doing. So you might be more specific than this, but I'm typing in service model training. And we might want to note here that it's a consultant. You can see I haven't planned this in advance. And this is how really budgets get made. I think there's just a lot of initial thinking, sometimes on paper, sometimes right into the Excel. And then you're going to do a lot of editing afterwards to make it all work. And so again, this person has a daily rate that they would charge if they were not providing the service for free. And, you know, it's actually a fabulous service. There's no maximum amount per day. And they're going to spend one day with you, but they're really donating that time. And so all of that is match that you can explain to us. And you can do that sort of thing. The same is true for evaluation. The purpose in evaluation, as I scroll this up a little bit, is not day-to-day data collection or performance measurement that you're responsible for your grant, but really a larger planned assessment of your implementation or community impact. And most often, to do that, the cost we would expect to see is maybe evaluation consulting. But there could be other costs related to the evaluation terms of purchasing data systems or that sort of thing that we could find here. But again, it's not for the regular day-to-day activity that you're doing. It's for a standalone evaluation or assessment of your implementation or community impact. And we're certainly excited and welcome money to be put into this category from new applicants, but it's often something we see more in continuations and in recompeting folks who are in the midst of an evaluation for their AmeriCorps program. Then everyone's favorite category we come to is other. And it really means other. Other equals other. Things that didn't fit elsewhere in the budget are going to get dumped in here. Some of the common things that we see in this category that we want to know about are member recognition. So if you're buying a item that isn't a gift, but it's kind of like a gift, but it's for the purpose of recognition, we want to know that maybe it's an AmeriCorps branded water bottle. Those are always good. Or it could be, you know, a plaque, or it could be an activity that folks get to participate in as part of a graduation ceremony from the AmeriCorps program. And there could be costs associated. That's an exciting thing to have in the other category. Something to note is we're very sensitive about food. Any food item needs to have a separate line in the other operating costs, and there needs to be a justification about why the food purchase is necessary for a specific activity to take place. These are federal funds and public funds, and they're very sensitive to around catering and the purchase of food. So unless the AmeriCorps members themselves are sitting and being, you know, lectured to while eating their meal, it's probably not an allowable expense. So we will need to discuss that, and that is why we like to see it on a separate line item. And that is a requirement of the AmeriCorps program. The other category we always want to see and is required in other operating costs is national service criminal history checks through TrueScreen and Field Print. And you can just copy and paste this exact wording into your budget. We require either that you have $55.75 for this purpose for each check, or an explanation as to how you're going to achieve this another way. Kind of the same with the AmeriCorps gear that I mentioned earlier. When you think about now, well, how many checks do you need to do? The answer is at minimum for each AmeriCorps member, and any other personnel charged to the grant, whether the AmeriCorps side, the CNCS share, or the grantee share. So we have, in our example, one program director. And at one point, though I deleted it, right, we had our supervisor at the site who was in-kinding their time. That person would be a second person on the budget if he or she was still here. And we would want that person as well. Consultants do not need to have a criminal background check completed. However, you can if you would like them to. So in our example of this budget, we really only have one staff person. And when I'm creating my budget, I'm going to do the 55.75 now times 11. And I'm going to put it all to the award there. So that's a required cost. Are there any ideas for things or questions about allowable expenses that you might be considering for your program that might fall into this sort of other category? No, no questions. All right. Well, the rain outside and the noon hour are not good for thinking. So just moving on. The section we get to now in developing our AmeriCorps budget is about member costs. And the living allowance is probably going to be the most, if you're choosing to do a living allowance, it's going to be the most expensive item in your budget, other than because there's going to be a number of AmeriCorps members, and you're going to potentially be providing them a significant amount of money each, right? So remember that the RFP has in it a table which shows for each AmeriCorps position commitment of 1,700 hours or 450 hours. There is possibly a minimum living allowance that's required and a maximum living allowance that you're allowed to provide. And you'll need to refer to that table when making your decision. The second thing I would ask you to think about very carefully is, what are the resources available to you to do this work versus what will help you with your recruitment efforts, and what is your sense of fairness and creating an equitable service opportunity that all can participate in? Because we know that living on the minimum AmeriCorps living allowance and living independently, meeting your basic needs, food and housing, can be extremely challenging. And most AmeriCorps members find that they need, if that's their path, that they need a second job, help from their family, or reliance on former savings to make ends meet. We also know that Rhode Island just increased the minimum wage to $11.50 an hour. And so we recommend having a robust living allowance as part of your program to the extent that you have the resources to do that in making your budget. So in this example that we were playing with, if we had 10 AmeriCorps members in our 1,200 hour position, we would go to the table in the RFP, and I'll cheat a little bit and tell you that it says that there is no minimum living allowance, and the maximum living allowance is $21,318. So I would say that, typically in this realm, we see people plan on the living allowance that is, say, $12,000 for the experience of being a 3/4 member. And it just so happens that that's very easy math to do when we're doing an example. So if you were doing that, if you had decided to give $12,000, which I would categorize as a reasonable but not necessarily robust living allowance for members who are going to commit to 1,200 hours, and you have 10 of those members, right, you're going to figure out how to put that into your budget. And I think it's helpful to do it as a formula, because then if you want to change the numbers in the Excel, you can really play with it. And that is a number, right? That is the largest number as we've gone through this presentation that we've come to. We're talking about $120,000 in total there. Now, AmeriCorps members not only have living allowance, but there are other costs that might be associated with providing them benefits or having them on the payroll. And one of the required things for the budget is to see, again, that there's FICA. So there will always be a line item that says FICA for members, the amount of living allowance times 7.65%. So you might remember that we have this 90,000 and 30,000. So I like to take that and just do 0765 and put that right in. See if Excel will play with me here. Ooh, fancy. The bonus of using Excel and to get those calculations. If your AmeriCorps members are full-time, and only if they're full-time, you're required to explain how you will provide health care to those AmeriCorps members if they're doing 1,700 hours. If they're not doing 1,700 hours, healthcare is fantastic to support AmeriCorps members with, but it is no longer required. So it's built into our example worksheet, but I'm going to take it out because our AmeriCorps members in this example are receiving healthcare through other ways on the state exchange as part of their family's plan, and not from the resources from the program. Just checking some notes. So we've already arrived in our sample budget down here of almost $130,000 in the member costs section, and 53,000 almost, in all the other operational costs. So you can see that an AmeriCorps budget can grow very significant, very fast. Now we get to the super fun part, and it makes me feel like we should all take a break and get a stretch. And that is understanding indirect cost. My first point about indirect cost in AmeriCorps budget making is you should expect to get it wrong and for Serve RI to work through it with you individually during the resolution process, because AmeriCorps has a fairly complicated set of instructions for providing you indirect costs on your budget. They start on page 43 of the RFP. And there are separate instructions for indirect cost in the CNCS share column and in the grantee share column. It's not like the other categories where we were kind of picking and choosing how we want to distribute the expense. They have very specific instructions that are for this and the CNCS side and for the grantee side. Now, those instructions are mathematically built into this worksheet. So we could just end here and not explain anything. And if you use the worksheet, these are the numbers that we would expect to see. And then if you decided in your budget you wanted different numbers, we would like you to tell us what the numbers are that the instructions produce, like $4,113, and then explain, but we claim 0 or we claim $3,000, which is always an oddity to us, but is not incorrect to do that if that's the instruction, or plan that your finance folks have determined. One of the things about, sorry, this scrolls on to the next page, that makes it hard to read. One of the things about indirect cost, and the reason why it's complicated, is that the state commission takes a portion of the indirect cost that you are able to receive and keeps it as an administrative fee as the pass-through entity that has to manage this federal award and provide you with customized training, technical assistance, and support throughout the year. So you are allowed to basically have 5% of all the direct costs as your indirect costs, but you only keep 3%, and Server I, the state commission, keeps 2% of that amount of money, which is why there is in the grant a corporation fixed amount and a commission fixed amount, which goes on to our next page here. And in indirect costs, you're going to separate out, following the instructions, those two different numbers. So when you approach page 43 in the instructions, the first thing you'll need to know is whether or not your organization already has an established federally approved indirect cost rate. Organizations that frequently have federal grants tied to one specific entity, like the Department of Education or Health and Human Services, are issued a letter from that agency that through all federal awards, they're approved for a specific indirect cost rate. If you have such a letter, you'll provide it to Server I, and you'll use that information to calculate your indirect cost. However, most community-based organizations do not have a federally approved indirect cost rate. Therefore, you're going to use the Corporation for National Community Service method, which basically allows you to claim 5% of the grant award as cash in your pocket for general expenses of indirect costs, and claim 10% of you of the budget as a contribution of match that you're making. I think that in this format, it's very challenging to explain the actual formulas. but you're going to need to have your direct costs, all figured out so that you can refer to them in order to complete the formula. That formula, in brief, is to look at the column and take the total amount of direct costs, which is the amount you're asking for all the operational things in section 1, the amount that you're asking for the member costs in section 2, and you're going to multiply it by a ratio, 5.26% or 0.0526. This is going to help you figure out what is 5% of the overall budget, which is the maximum amount that you can claim. You're then to figure out the 3% versus 2% split between your organization and the commission. You take that number and you multiply it by 0.6 for the amount that you will receive from the corporation, and then you take that number and multiply it times 0.4. The commission gets to keep that fixed amount in this other line item. I know that's you're confused. I'm confused explaining it, which is why I prefaced this at the very beginning, that when you first build your budget, you may in fact not get this wrong. I recommend using this worksheet because the formulas are built in already. And you can double check your work against this worksheet. On the screen, I know it's pretty small. I'm trying to highlight here this formula, which shows the 5.26% and the 0.6 being multiplied by the correct direct cost totals. I want to wrap up, and I'm sure you do too. Once you've completed your budget and it's all together and you're entering it into eGrants, there is a section in the budget also called source of match. And it's very easy to overlook this in the eGrant system, but there will be, orange text where it says, click on this to enter information about the source of your matching funds. So when you're doing that, there are 4 things that you're kind of really highlighting. And you need to go through. So every time you have a line item where some of the expense is coming from an in-kind donation or from your own resources and not the federal award, you need to explain that and what is the source for those funds. You're going to state the amount, and in this example on the screen, I'll say $5,000. The source, sort of how do you achieve this money, and is it from a federal, meaning a federal grant, the state, public money from the state, or local, sort of like a private contribution. So in this case, we're talking about individual giving that you do at your organization, which is a local source. You're going to explain the type. Is it cash or is it an in-kind? So those are the two options. I want you to use cash, or is it an in-kind donation from a partner, or is it cash from your organization? And its status. So this is money that you already have or that you propose to have during the course of the project. And so in our example here, you would write in the source of match $5,000 from individual giving. That's local, it's cash, and it's proposed because the giving campaign hasn't started yet. And you need to explain that in particular for those things that are in kind, and you might have a category that is philanthropic giving, $42,000 proposed. It doesn't necessarily have to be known to you at the time of applying, but it has to be reasonable and will be reviewed to see if there's a risk here that we think you won't really be able to receive those sources of match and carry out the program. When it comes to match, just a note from the RFP that you can use other federal funds to match an AmeriCorps award if your other federal grant-making agency gives you permission to do so. So it's okay. Typically, federal grants they like to leverage the local contribution and not have you say, well, we're using this federal award to match this federal award. AmeriCorps permits this, but again, there has to be permission that you have personally from the other grant program that it's okay to use your federal funding in that way. When it comes to the Department of Education, the US Department of Education, those federal funds have, there could be exceptions, but are almost universally permissible to be used as match to AmeriCorps grants. If you have questions about that, please contact us directly. So your budget is done. You've gone through the worksheet, you've done the source, figured out your sources of match. It's time to go back and just check a few things. There are some rules that AmeriCorps has in its laws and regulations for AmeriCorps finance. One is that your equipment costs cannot exceed 10% of what you're asking for from the CNCS share. Your indirect cost cannot exceed 5%, which is going to be the case because you'll have followed the formulas. You need to know that your living allowance complies with the minimum maximum that are published in the RFP. You have to make sure that your budget addresses the AmeriCorps member identification issue, perhaps a beautiful fleece AmeriCorps vest with a brand new stitched logo. You have to show that you're going to complete National Service criminal history checks by using the dollar amount 55.75 times the amount of members and staff, or explain the alternative plan in the budget itself. There has to be FICA for the AmeriCorps members, and it needs to be included in the fringe rate that you use. And if you have full-time AmeriCorps members, there has to be an explanation of health insurance in the budget. Whew. I know that I did not do indirect cost justice, and we'll think about how we can be better trainers on that front. I sort of lost a little bit of steam. There's no doubt about that. And but I want to make sure that I address all the questions. And one of the questions we have is, I don't really kind of like, I don't understand the budget narrative part. When you're writing the application, you do not need to explain your budget in the narrative text. The place that you need to explain your budget is by adding enough detail into the budget itself that we can read it as a narrative. So when you, instead of saying, we need a person and they cost $40,000, you might provide the position title and explain very briefly, maybe it's program associate, comma, responsible for member recruitment and supervision. Just a little extra information in the eGrants budget module itself to provide that narrative. And then it also provides a text box where you enter in the mathematical formula, like $42,000 a year times 0.5 FTE. So you are correct that the current application format doesn't require paragraphs of explanation for the budget. If we have questions based on the budget you submit in sort of the table format, we can resolve those in narrative form after the fact.